Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name's Sam Cossa. I'm from Friends of the Earth. We're all here today from Friends of the Earth International to talk about the influence of corporate capture in the CBD and how this could affect our new global biodiversity framework. We're very lucky to have 4 panelists with us from different regions of the world and from different Friends of the Earth groups who've been working on these issues for a number of years. First of all, to my right, we have Hermantha, who is the Friends of the Earth International Chair. Thank you very much for joining us, Hermantha, from Sri Lanka. We've got Nale Marini, who's the Friends of the Earth International Program Coordinator on Forests and Biodiversity. We're going to have Marianne joining us, Parasi soon from Nigeria, who's an agroecology expert. And we've got Dana from Friends of the Earth US, who's a Senior Food and Agriculture Program Manager from the US. Thank you so much for joining us, and please get us started, Hermantha.
Thank you very much. I'm coming from Sri Lanka. I'm the chair of the Friends of the Earth International. I want to speak to you about the global biodiversity framework, which I have been discussing for several years now. And the draft, somewhat draft text is now ready. And as every one of know that there is the local people, local communities, and the indigenous people, especially hold the biodiversity, protect the biodiversity all across the world, especially in the southern hemisphere. And so we know that they are the one who develop the biodiversity, who use the knowledge, traditional knowledge, to enhance the biodiversity and use the plant varieties and all for various medicines, etc. But under the global biodiversity framework, we see that it's not so ambitious, and it's talking about only 5%, the 20% of the reducing extinction risk by 2030, which is not very ambitious. The rate that biodiversity destruction is happening all across the world, I think you have seen certain reports came 2020 that more than 70% of the wildlife has been destroyed in the last 50 years, and we see that a lot of fragmentation of all the ecosystem, especially the forest areas across the world which hold the biodiversity, and this global framework is talking about only 5% of the ecosystems, and the connectivity will be protected by increase the protection by 2030, and by 2050 they are talking about 15 to 20% increase the protection and the connectivity. So we don't see that this as a very ambitious plan. On top of that, we see that the global corporations, the huge oil mining corporations and agro-commodity corporations, they have a seat in these negotiations, and they are the one really responsible for the destruction of many of our ecosystems in many of the countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and all across the world. But they have a strong voice in these the tables, because they have the power, they have the whole marketing mechanisms, and they have their public relations officers coming to these meetings. And we see that the public and indigenous people's voices are hidden when it comes to this kind of corporate capture of these spaces. So we are very much distracted by this approach of the biodiversity conference here, and we see that in the coming days, it's already happening, that they will be talking about nature positive language and the nature-based solutions and various other beautiful words, but which are not bringing actually the justice to the local indigenous people and the local communities who have been protecting, who have been conserving this biodiversity for many of these centuries. If you want to give if you want to accept the role of indigenous people, I think we have to, Biodiversity Secretariat has to keep away the voices of the private corporations and they have to listen to the local communities more and more, indigenous people more and more. I think that's how you can bring a very down to earth global biodiversity framework. I think that's one of the message we want to communicate to you, and it should not be run by the billionaires companies, but it should be depend on the voices of the local indigenous people. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Hemanta. Nele, the Friends of the Earth International Forest and Biodiversity Program Coordinator.
Thank you very much, Sam. And yes, I would like to pick up where Hemanta kind of left on the issue of many corporations who are present here and who really influence the negotiations. And as Hemanta has rightfully said, these corporations are destroying biodiversity around the world. So that means that really why governments need to come together in this multilateral space. Multilateral space means a space for coordination for governments, and their main tasks should be to regulate those who destroy biodiversity, which in our opinion means regulating business. Now, that is not what we are seeing happening here. On the contrary, we are seeing that business is influencing a lot these negotiations. And so we have made, as Friends of the Earth, a report on this. It's called Nature of Business. You can find it on our Friends of the Earth website. There's also, we have made a QR code, which we can make available for you. So in this report, we lay out what are all the difficulties, what's the ways in which in which corporations, influence the governments, but also what is the result of that. And so the biggest result of that is actually that greenwashing measures are being presented as if they were policies. And we're having a beautiful biodiversity framework and it has beautiful words in it. And actually, a lot of that is greenwashing. So you present to the world as if there will be a good outcome here and as if people can go to sleep nicely because biodiversity problem will be solved. And actually what it is greenwashing measures, which makes that there does not need to be any change in behavior of the corporations. Which greenwashing measures are we talking about? Specifically, nature-based solutions, nature positive. Nature positive means that it's okay to destroy biodiversity somewhere and to preserve or restore it somewhere else. So the destruction of the biodiversity is minus biodiversity. The restoration or conservation is plus biodiversity. You add, you sum, and if that mathematical exercise results positive, you claim it's nature positive. Now that's something totally different than saying a positive as it has a positive connotation as a word. That's not what it refers to here. So this is really problematic. Even more so if you know that much of this offsetting, the promises of conservation, the promises of restoration, is actually not what happens in reality. So you have the destruction, you have a promise for restoration, which then doesn't happen. So this is really greenwashing, and it allows corporations to say, we are doing our nature positive project and we are a green company, and everybody goes applauding. Now, this also relates closely to the climate issue, because if we look in the climate convention, all the countries there made pledges on how much carbon emissions they are going to reduce. Our friends from the Third World Network made a beautiful report on this, which is called the Land Cap Report. And in that report, it details how many emissions, how many hectares will the sum of all the countries need in order to create all this new nature that would offset it. We are talking about 600 million of hectares over the next decades. These hectares, this land does not exist. There's a lot of pressure on the land, so that also really affects the rights of indigenous peoples, of local communities. Their lands will be taken away in order to create these offsetting sites, and it will be insufficient because this land does not exist. And even worse, in the Biodiversity Convention, we are talking about neutral. In the first few years, we're talking about neutral, and like you lose so much, you win so much, and by nearing 2030, we would go positive. That's the plan. But in climate, we are saying, oh, biodiversity will actually offset the climate emissions. And therefore also we can see that what is called nature-based solutions, which again is offsetting, actually it is nature-based climate solutions. It is nature or biodiversity becoming a solution for the climate, and in that not taking into account that actually what is suffering is biodiversity, is the one which is suffering from the climate, and it's supposed to become the solution for the climate. There's a severe incoherence there. So we're also very worried on this, and we think as Friends of the Earth that the most important thing that the CBD needs to do now is to really regulate the corporations, make sure that they can't come up with greenwashing measures, and we really need to make sure that there's a shift in the models which address all of these problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nelly. We now have Dana from Friends of the Earth US.
Thank you so much. I'd like to address another major issue that we're seeing in the biodiversity conference, which is the corporate capture of the agrochemical industry. One of the major things that we're discussing here is how to assess and monitor biotechnologies, particularly framed in the use for conservation of nature. However, one of the things that we're seeing is that biotechnologies such as genetic engineering, used mostly for pesticides, is owned at this point virtually by 3 major corporations in the world. Now we're seeing these companies consolidate even more. These pesticide companies are combining with biotechnology companies producing genetic engineering, primarily for use in agriculture. So we're looking now at this corporate capture of nature, particularly through growing food. Some of the examples of genetic engineering in agriculture that we're starting to see over the last 10 years include gene silencing pesticides, for example, gene drives for use in insects and animals, new genetically engineered plants, genetically engineered soil microbes, and the list goes on even to include genetically engineered viruses. These are genetic engineering and biotechnologies that we need to be watching, we need to be assessing, we need to be monitoring, and we need the convention to be making decisions to make sure that we are looking forward and being precautionary in our regulations. So what specifically is happening at the CBD that's important for us? We're looking at how to look forward and evaluate new technologies. We're looking at whether these assessments will include a broad range of knowledge. Will it be participatory? Will it include the knowledge and practices of Indigenous and local communities? Who controls these decisions? At this moment, we're seeing an increase in the influence of corporations on the decisions that are made here at the CBD, and we need to make sure that doesn't continue. Who assesses these technologies as they're used, particularly from a flow of northern countries into southern countries where there's still rich biodiversity? The way this plays out in the text is in terms like horizon scanning, technology assessment and monitoring. We're seeing that in terms of access and benefit sharing. And it's these points in which we're seeing the question of corporate control of genetic technologies versus honoring traditional knowledge and local control. That's the decision that we're making here. It's a question of whether or not natural resources will be framed as monetary profit or whether it will be a non-monetary approach. So we really need to avoid the facade of these false solutions, and we need the Convention on Biodiversity to make strong precautionary decisions that back up that nature is not for sale to biotechnology companies. Thank you.
Thank you. We now have Marianne from Friends of the Earth Nigeria.
My colleagues and comrades have already said so much, so I'll just add a little. We are here gathered here to protect and speak about nature, people, communities, and it's surprising that we are far from it. The people we are supposed to save are not central in the discussions that are going on here. And we are alarmed personally to hear that issues like precautionary principle, where there is doubt, you should apply the brakes, but people are going on as if nothing is happening. The survival of our country, the survival of nature depends on the decisions of what people do here. Our community people, indigenous people, fisher folks, forest-dependent people who protect biodiversity, who feed the world, are being threatened, harassed, colonized by corporate companies. We have their rights violated. Some of them are killed. Some of them are thrown out from their ancestral places. And here we are playing politics with things that matter. This is called the Convention for Biological Diversity. It's all about the people. It's all about nature. It's all about people who matter. But decisions so far are not anywhere near to talk about people who really matter, the communities, indigenous people. We're also talking about agroecology food, not just some forms of adding things to food that make people so sick. Have we ever thought about how people recently, even where I come from, people are getting so sick because of what has been done to our food? That's why we are telling our government, why not go the way of agroecology that says agriculture in harmony with nature, not against it? Agriculture that protects people, agriculture that nourishes our body, while bringing all these externalities, pesticides, poisons into our food. And if you must bring all these technologies, why not have mechanisms that protect the people? Why do you want to remove everything that safeguards our people? Why don't you want precaution? Why don't you want to put in languages that say that protect the people, quote and unquote, that you say you are trying to save, if you are doing business as usual? So we've come here today to say that our people, our communities, these are people who actually protect the biodiversity. These are people who feed the world. These are people who are doing everything possible to ensure that that nature is saved. That as you go into those conferences, as you go into those working groups, think about them, think about the survival of the world, and know that whatever decisions you are taking is going to affect the people back home. We have no planet B. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marianne. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. We also wanted to invite the people here today to the march that is happening tomorrow, which will be at 1 p.m. It's honouring the environmental defenders, Indigenous people and local communities and the role they play in protecting and preserving biodiversity. I also wanted to open it up now for questions from the floor for any of our speakers.
Martin Patnon-Monette, Journaliste Neuf.
Hello, Martin from Journalist Neuf.
Based here in Montreal. I don't know elsewhere around the world, but here in Quebec and in Canada, we kind of summarize this summit around the 30 by 30 goal. And we compare it, well, we like journalists and like most of people around, compare it to the goal of Paris Agreement about the 1.5 degree. But in my sense, when I read the goal A now in the treaty, the first option tried more to like get real clear goal around net outcomes. So I'm curious about what do you think about that? Like, what would be the real goals, main goal of this treaty to be clear to have restoration of biodiversity?
I think I'll pass that to Nelly.
Thank you so much. And that's a real very valid question, because indeed 30 by 30 is being proposed by many as the big outcome of this conference. And it's actually quite controversial. Area-based conservation is very important. We really need area-based conservation. Now the question is how and where and governed by who. If you have area-based conservation that is really putting out the indigenous peoples from their area, you create a lot of human rights issue, but also we have seen in many cases that actually these areas where there is people who used to live there in the territories and who used to take care of them, to protect them, they're being pushed out, and later on these territories actually are vulnerable for other incursions by, for example, corporations. So it's not always because a protected area is called a protected area that it is good nature. What we really think is we need the area-based conservation, yes, but if you put a strict number on it without the right measures, it can be quite wrong. Actually, around a third of the world is in the hands of indigenous peoples, but many of them are not managing to get a proper conservation status. So we need to support them, and we do not need to support the other kind of conservation. And we think that actually putting that number forward can be distracting. The thing is also, in climate, it's very easy to have very clear numerical outcomes, because it's just everything is about how many greenhouse gases are in the atmosphere. Whereas biodiversity is, by its definition, complex, diverse. It needs to be taken into account so many different factors. So it's also a lot more difficult to have this kind of clear-cut outcome, and people are calling for it. But when you do it, you quite often lose a lot of the detailed elements, which are very, very important. So that's dangerous as well. And yes, you refer to the element of the net in the goal A, and that is exactly the problem. Because if you're saying you can destroy and you will restore it, then you can destroy thousands and thousands and millions of hectares, and you promise that you will restore them, but the restoration is never of the quality of the original, and quite often it actually doesn't even happen. So what we need is two different goals: one on avoiding destruction, and I'm sure we can't avoid all destruction. If we need a hospital and there is really no other space than an area with nature, okay, but it needs to be really thought through. But that needs to be the minimal thing. You don't need all the destruction for many highways, for mining, for shopping malls. There's so many things we just should say no to. And that needs to be a part of the negotiation, to say stop destruction of vulnerable ecosystems. And you need a target on restoration, but you can't make that a summing up game. That is just a no-go for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Were there any other questions from the floor? Don't just wait for the microphone. Thank you so much.
Sorry, it's Catherine Early from China Dialogue. I just wondered, I mean, your report seems to treat all corporations as being bad, and I just wondered if you saw any nuance at all between some that are trying and some that are, you know, doing all the things you're saying. And I mean, for example, you're talking about businesses only wanting voluntary action, and I think that's certainly true in the past, but there's businesses here wanting, you know, they're campaigning for mandatory disclosure, for example. So, yeah, just wondered what you had to say about that.
I could quickly respond to the Make It Mandatory campaign. So that's around the task force, the Task Force for Nature-Based Financial Disclosure, which, if what we look at it is a corporate-led process, a corporate-led multi-stakeholder process. Target 15 around business is really meant to be addressing some of the serious impacts that business has on nature. And some of the original text looked at issues of reducing impact by 50%. And so I think what you see with the Make It Mandatory campaign is really focusing on one process, which is a corporate-led process, which is mainly focused on the financial sector. So yeah, what happens is it's really become a very narrow, specific corporate-led campaign. So I think we need to be very skeptical of that. There's a similar process in terms of financial disclosure in terms of climate, and that has had many issues as well. So I think focusing on something as specific, and also when the corporations control what they can disclose and lead the process, we need to be very skeptical. I don't know if you had a comment, Dana, or...
I think in general, what we're seeing here in the negotiations is that corporations, particularly around genetic engineering, biotech, pesticides, are lobbying for patent protection, are lobbying for the deregulation of genetic technologies, and are lobbying to remove language around synthetic biology, around their products, components, and organisms, which essentially really ties the hands of local and indigenous communities or even governments to have robust and precautionary assessments. I don't think that we see very many genetic engineering and biotechnology companies that are willing to voluntarily use precautionary regulations or risk assessments. And partly that's because in this industry around pesticides and genetic engineering technologies, it's really just three major industries and corporations, where you have ChemChina, which now owns Syngenta, you have Bayer, which now owns Monsanto, and DuPont and Dow, which have been combined. It's very expensive to be producing genetic engineering technologies. Even the startups are being bought up. So while there may be examples of what you're speaking within biotechnology and pesticides, we have very, very few examples, and that's certainly not what's driving these negotiations.
Nelly, and if anyone else from the panel?
Yes, I'd like to add a couple of points. First, on your question, if there are better business, I think most corporations, their main mandate is to give profit to their shareholders. And that profit, in many, many cases, goes against biodiversity. So there is an inherent conflict of interest. The mandate of a corporation is not to save biodiversity. That being said, I think there are different types of businesses who will do good things. So it's not that we are against economic activity in general, but also those businesses who are better, they have no problem with being regulated because they already do so. So if we are calling for regulation, it's for all. And that will be hard on those who are behaving bad, and it will be easy on those who are behaving well. The regulation is not a punishment. Regulation is a baseline to make sure that we can all live within planetary boundaries. And it's not like, oh, you are behaving well, therefore we are punishing you. No, it's just setting the rules for everybody. The good ones are behaving well, and they will just automatically comply. It's not a problem. So that's one thing. I also wanted to briefly come back to the issue of the mandatory reporting. Two things. One is reporting does not change the outcome. I've yet to see the case in which, because of reporting, actually the biodiversity loss goes down. Two, the kind of reporting which is on the table does not report on biodiversity destruction, does not report on complaints the companies have received, does not report on human rights abuses. The main focus of this reporting, which is on the table and is asked to be mandatory, is actually about the risk biodiversity loss poses to business, which according to me is actually not a focus of this convention. This convention's focus is to save biodiversity, not to save the business from biodiversity problems. We are turning things around here.
Thank you so much. Marianne, and then we have another question from the floor.
Still on the issue of corporations, I think my grandma says, if you have to hide what you are doing, then you shouldn't be doing it. You find out that most times these people, they're in spaces, they are investing a lot of money, they're trying to write the laws. Why are you circumventing the laws? Why do you want to protect yourself? That means there's something wrong somewhere. If you have nothing to hide, I mean, you should be happy that there should be regulations. There should be some checks and balances. They don't want any checks. They don't want any control. They don't want anybody to beam their light on them. What are you scared of? What are you doing that you don't want people to look at? Then you shouldn't be doing it. So like my colleagues have said, I think there are very few. I mean, there are very good ones, but there are very few. In Africa, all the ones I know, I'm sorry, they're very, very bad people. And they're doing very bad things to our people, from destruction of lands, from contamination. I mean, the issue, I come from Nigeria, the South Side, what Shell has done to our people, from Michelin, what they've done to community-dependent people. The forest people have been sacked, their lands have been taken away. The issue of Dominion Farms, who came to a community, took over a whole land and want to grow products that the community people don't eat, but just for exports, and then they bring it back to us as finished products. So you look at these things, and they are here, and then they are, I mean, there's a lot of money. They have a lot of money. We are up against people with money and power, but we have our voices, we have the people, but then they don't want rules. I think something is seriously wrong somewhere, and that's what we said. There have to be checks, there have to be regulations, and people who say they are for the people, our government, have to look into this and take the sides of the people and not the sides of profit. Thank you.
Thank you. A question over here.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, I'm Mark Shapiro. I'm a journalist from the States. I'm working also with the Earth Journalism Network here and with Inside Climate News. So basically, just a question.
Your mask, sir.
Oh, sorry. Thank God. Take the mask off. So I'm sorry. So Mark Shapiro. I'm a journalist from the States and with the Earth Journalism Network. And the obviously there's a big, and I'm sorry I might have missed the beginning of this panel, but there's a lot of discussion here about digital sequence information, about access to genetic resources in different, mostly developing countries, and the question of access and benefit sharing, which would strike directly at access to resources. So I was wondering what, if any, role the agricultural companies are playing, the food companies who might want access to those resources are playing in the shaping of the ABS DSI approach.
I think Dana will speak to that.
Thanks for the question, and certainly it's a complicated answer. But yeah, I think that what we're seeing play out in the digital sequencing and the access and benefit sharing conversation really mirrors what we're seeing with the conversation around corporate control in agriculture and biotechnologies. In particular, there's a lot of pressure from patenting and in the question of confidential business information. We're seeing a real north-south division amongst where a lot of those corporate agriculture companies are based, and the desire to not have transparency, to not have that open.
Let me just ask you specifically, how are they trying to shape the rules that are actually evolving?
Yeah, I would suggest that those rules are around removing the local access. That is about not having the open, transparent databases, which would impede on the confidential business information and trademark patent of companies. It's also impeding on the access of local communities with and indigenous knowledge and practices, and it puts the control over natural resources into this profit model. I might hand this also over to my colleague.
Thank you. I think digital sequencing information discussion is coming in the line of the access to benefit sharing. So now, when it comes to the ownership of these resources, the local communities, local people, indigenous people, so they have been the one protecting these biodiversity and the genetic resources. But suddenly we see that these companies are going to come with sort of academics and maybe non-transparent agreements with probably the academics or probably some of those researchers in the countries, and then the local communities will not have any access to information, and therefore they will not be able to get any information, and they might not get any benefit sharing. So I think when you put this kind of regulations or the kind of clauses into the international conventions, the local people always keep away from these discussions, and suddenly they see their own resources have been mishandled, misused by the companies. I think that's one of the biggest danger. So in many of our countries now, in my country, Sri Lanka is one of the biodiversity hotspots among the most important 30 biological hotspots in the world. Now suddenly we don't have any information discussion at the local level, so the local communities don't know anything what's happening. The companies come and have these agreements with the tech companies in the countries and the universities, and so we don't see this is going to be a very helpful for the communities. It's much more dangerous, I think. So that's how we see about this issue.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we might have a question over there on the right side. Is there someone? Have you got a microphone there? Or you're holding the microphone? Ah, okay. Did we have any more questions? Going once? Going twice? Well, thank you all very much for joining us for this press conference. And again, there's a march on tomorrow that we'd really encourage everyone to join in terms of demanding environmental justice. And thank you very much to all our speakers. I think it's been a really insightful panel.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, good, good.
I am very sensitive. I understand.
The reason everybody that knows, I just told them I'm very sensitive. So that's why. How was it? I didn't have time to prepare. Yes. Okay, yeah, that's good enough. Then tomorrow afternoon, how, because I can't
Let's
do the-
leave.
Yeah, yes, yes.